So this past weekend, Alabama hosted their Champions Cookout, and it was filled with some of the nation's top high school prospects. But if you look online, that hasn't been the topic of conversation. And in fact, the topic of conversation has been twofold. First and foremost, people are talking about how Alabama's bitter in-state rivals, the Auburn Tigers, were able to flip two very talented prospects away from Alabama's class. And that leads us into the second area of conversation. How much does in-state recruiting matter? Well, today we aim to tackle both of these conversations. We need to ask and answer the question, how much does in-state recruiting matter? And in doing so, we will address the two flips. But before we can, as always, y'all know the drill. I have got to hear from you. Hop down to the comments, Y for yes, N for no. Do you believe in-state recruiting matters? And if so, how much? I can't wait to hear from you. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe. Hit that bell notification as I do constant college football content. You don't want to miss any of it. And if you enjoyed the content, be sure to like and comment down below, as those interactions seem small. They are massive to content creators such as myself. But having said all of that, let's jump right into this. And first and foremost, we need to talk about the two guys who flipped away from Alabama's class. First being defensive lineman Antonio Coleman, and then second, athlete Derek Smith. We'll start with Derek Smith, as he may be rated as an athlete, but Alabama wanted him as a safety. And when you turn on the film, easy to understand why. In fact, Coach Sean and I talked about this on Friday on the live stream about how this is a guy that we could easily see playing safety at the college level, continuing to develop, and then making his way to the NFL. But Auburn had a bit of an interesting pitch for Derek Smith. They were telling him, hey, if you want to play wide receiver, we'll be able to satisfy that request. And this is something we talked about on the live stream. I am personally in favor of someone such as a Derek Smith figuring out in high school, hey, this is the position I want to play, and realizing that before he ever steps on campus and gets to be a part of the locker room. Because at the point where he realized, hey, I don't want to play safety at the next level, I'd love to play wide receiver, that's going to be better for him and the entire environment around him. So it makes complete sense to me that Auburn was able to get this flip, especially if they were selling, hey, we'll use you at safety or maybe at wide receiver. Where do you want to play? Whereas Alabama was more saying, hey, we like you at the safety position. We love the wide receivers we have in this class. We didn't want to take too many of them. We're really only looking at one more guy. We want to keep you at that safety position. If that flexibility meant something to Derek Smith, then I think it's a good thing ultimately that he found that, because that's going to lead to happiness for him, and it's going to be more conducive to success both for him and for the environment that he's a part of. Because the last thing you want is someone getting on campus, realizing that they're not happy playing the position they're at, and then they're not happy throughout the season. Their buy-in isn't there. And while I'm not saying that's what would have happened, I'm just making a larger case using this as an example. I think y'all get that. But Derek Smith, incredibly talented athlete. And in fact, if we look at the 24/7 Sports Composite, he comes in as the number 51 player in the entirety of high school football, the number 2 athlete, and a top 5 player in the state of Alabama, coming in at number 3. But that's not the only in-state loss Alabama sustained. Now we move the conversation to Antonio Coleman. And this is a bit of an interesting conversation because Antonio Coleman is very talented. If we look at the 24/7 Sports Composite, he comes in at number 153 nationally, the number 20 defensive line, and one of the top players in the state of Alabama per the 24/7 Sports Composite. And defensive line, we all know, is a position of premium. That's somewhere where teams are really searching in the portal. They're really searching in recruiting because big guys up front that are athletic can make or break a defensive scheme. And Antonio Coleman is very talented. But one thing that has been really interesting about Coleman's process is that this isn't the first time he's flipped. In fact, this isn't the second time he's flipped. This was a guy who was one time committed to Alabama, then flipped to Auburn, flipped back to Alabama from Auburn, and has now flipped back to Auburn from Alabama. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens going forward. But I think it's important to note that when you look at 24/7 Sports, whenever you're looking at the roster breakdown of both Auburn and Alabama, Alabama has 12 defensive linemen on campus right now, whereas Auburn only has 7. So if immediate playing time was something that was going to move the needle for Antonio Coleman, Auburn had a far easier pitch in doing so than did Alabama. And look, I'm not trying to minimize what Auburn did on either case. Derek Smith or Antonio Coleman. They did great work this weekend. They got some major wins, and now they find themselves squarely in the top 10 recruiting classes in all of college football. And that's exactly where you need to be in the SEC. Because if we look at those top 10 recruiting classes, 7 of the top 10 are SEC schools. And what's even more wild to me is that 5 of those 7 would have been in the SEC West had the SEC not done away with that with the addition of Texas and Oklahoma, only going to further prove how wild the SEC West actually was. But that's neither here nor there. We've talked about these 2 flips that Auburn was able to get from Alabama, but now we need to ask the larger question. How much does in-state recruiting matter? Because if we look right now, Auburn has got a ton of wins for in-state guys. And if we look at Alabama's class, they're in a position to only have 2 top 15 players from the state of Alabama, being Micah DeBose and Turbo Rogers. And this has led many people online to ask the question, how much does in-state recruiting matter? Well, the answer is a little bit complex, and as all things in life, it requires a little bit of nuance. So that's exactly what we're going to do here. I think that's something that we always try and aim to do. We always talk football, but we never shy away from the nuance of a conversation because, in my opinion, as Coach Sean says, the truth is in the details. And oftentimes we need to further expand the details to get a full scope of the truth. When we look at in-state recruiting right now for Alabama, my take would be as follows. It's not about winning every battle in your state lines. Recruiting is far too national now. It's very difficult to do so, though Auburn has done a good job at getting these guys to buy in. It's about winning the battles you can't afford to lose. That's the most important thing. In fact, I had this similar conversation. If anybody wants to hop down to the comments and say, you're only saying this because it's Alabama, we talked about this with the Texas Longhorns not too long ago, where I asked the question, is Texas recruiting in trouble? And my take was as follows. No, yes, Oregon has gotten big wins in the state of Texas. Alabama has gotten big wins in the state of Texas. All these different colleges have been able to go and get big wins in the state of Texas. But I didn't think that that meant Texas fans should panic. Why? Because you're not going to win every battle in your state. It's about winning the battles you can't afford to lose. And when we look at Alabama, this is where the nuance of the conversation comes in. This is a coaching staff that, outside of some of the supplemental people who do a phenomenal job building relationships, cultivating relationships, and outside of Roach and Gillespie, there's a lot of new on this staff. Where when we look at the Auburn staff, this is a staff that has far more continuity, top to bottom, than does Alabama. So in my opinion, it makes far more sense that whenever so many people are coming into a brand new environment trying to recruit Alabama, Auburn would be able to be ahead in that department. They've had established relationships with these guys that far extend past what Alabama has been able to do. And yes, you can say, well, Freddie Roach has been there, but it's one thing for your position coach to have that extended relationship. That's awesome. That can really open doors. But it's how many people on that roster do you have a long-standing positive relationship with? And remember, not long ago, we talked about that it's the quality of relationship, not the length. But if you can marry both of those concepts and have a relationship of high quality that has been a longer lasting relationship than another high quality relationship, now you're cooking with fire. And unfortunately for Alabama fans, that's where they find themselves in competing with Auburn for some of these in-state guys. Something else I would point your attention to is that we are very early in the recruiting process still. It's July. And I don't say that to say, hey, watch for Alabama to flip a bunch of guys from Auburn. I say that to say that inevitably between now and December early signing day and the national signing day, this staff is going to continue furthering their relationships in the state, furthering their relationships nationally. And who knows what good that will do, because we do know what a great job this staff does at cultivating positive relationships. So does in-state recruiting matter? The answer is yes, but it's a complex question to answer. Not complex in the type of answer you're going to get, but complex in the sense that, are you getting big wins elsewhere? The answer for Alabama is yes. If that's the case, then that diminishes the impact exponentially of some in-state losses. Because even with Auburn flipping these 2 very talented prospects away from Alabama, we look at where Alabama ranks. They're the number 2 recruiting class in the nation per the 24/7 Sports Composite. They have the second highest average recruit rank just behind Oregon. They have 4 less commits than Ohio State and are right on their heels. They have 2 less commits than Georgia and are in front of them. And they have 1 less commit than Auburn and are in front of them. Now, it's also important to note that 24/7 Sports doesn't have Steve Mbuma as a part of the 25 class yet, whereas On3 does. So if you're looking at the disparity between numbers between On3 and 24/7 Sports, that's where that disparity stems from. But nonetheless, whenever we ask the question, does in-state recruiting matter? If Alabama was ranked as the number 12 recruiting class in the nation right now, and was sustaining these losses to Auburn, the answer to that question would be a lot easier. It would be easy to say, yeah, this is something we're looking at. Now, it would still be true that this staff is new. They haven't been able to cultivate those relationships. If this continues into year 2, 3, 4, and 5, now we have a different conversation. But it's not like this staff is not recruiting at an elite level. You unpack this, they're the number 2 recruiting class in the nation and are getting phenomenal wins, are positioning themselves for phenomenal wins. That's why I say this is a bit more of a complex question to answer, and it's not as simple as a yes and no. In-state recruiting is always going to be something that matters. To what degree depends on the success you're seeing nationally. And when we look at the success this Alabama staff is seeing nationally, they're doing a phenomenal job. There is nothing but time and opportunity between now and early signing day and inevitably national signing day. Who's to say they don't flip somebody who's in the state of Alabama committed elsewhere? It could easily happen. So it's far too early to panic. But I did see these conversations online, and I saw people saying, oh, see, DeBoer, he's not going to be able to recruit the South. He's losing all these battles. He's losing these battles to coaching staffs that have far greater continuity in terms of their relationship capacity. And even then, he's in the battles. Even then, he has the number 2 ranked recruiting class in the nation. And even then, Alabama still seems like they're in a great position for several more prospects thereafter. Now, if we want to really go deep into the weeds of this conversation, and you're saying, hey, Ty, I'm worried about defensive line recruiting. Where does Alabama go from there? Well, like I alluded to just a few minutes ago in this video, Steve Mbuma is a part of the 25 class, and that's going to be something that alleviates defensive line recruiting for this staff in the class of 2025. Because the guy that you thought was going to be in the 24 class is now going to be a part of this 25 class. He is going to JUCO. He will be a part of the 25 class for everything I have seen. That's exactly what you hope. But there is no question that every single year you want to get big-time defensive line wins, but you want to get the right guys. At every turn, it's about getting the right guys. I don't care if they come from Alabama. I don't care if they come from Texas. Hell, I don't care if they come from Alaska. It's about getting the right guys. You look at John Mechie, he wasn't from Alabama. You look at Bryce Young, he wasn't from Alabama. Najee Harris, he wasn't from Alabama. Devontae Smith, he wasn't from Alabama. Jerry Jeudy, he wasn't from Alabama. Jalen Waddle. And that's not to say that Alabama hasn't had phenomenal players come from inside the state lines, because there are no shortage of guys that are incredible. My point there isn't to diminish Alabama. It's to only prove great players come from everywhere. It's about getting the right players. Because if you wanted to say, well, Ty, what about Julio? I'd say you're 100% right. One of the greatest players I've ever had the privilege of watching. But you know what I would also say? Ryan Williams was an incredibly big win. And if they're able to hold on to a Micah DeBose and a Turbo Rogers, and they feel like they have gotten all they need in this class, you have to trust in the staff. You have to trust in the staff that currently has the number 2 recruiting class in the nation. So, does in-state recruiting matter? Yes. Does in-state recruiting matter? No. It all just depends on the successes you're able to have nationally, and are you getting the right guys? That, in my opinion, is the far bigger question. Recruiting is far too national now to only focus in your state. And if you're seeing immense success all across the nation, and you're getting guys that fit your scheme, that fit your culture, that to me matters far more. But I can't wait to hear from all of you. Hop down to the comments. Let me know what you're thinking. That's it. See ya.